Crystal Fyffe was coming home with a pizza when somebody caught her outside and shot her in the head before she made it indoors. When police worked the scene, her phone and keys were still there. Nothing appeared stolen, while nobody could identify the shooter. The untouched property gave investigators reason to consider whether somebody had come specifically for Crystal instead of taking whatever she carried. One detail made the case harder to shake, since Robert Killer B Leadbetter, the man prosecutors later blamed, was already sitting behind bars. That was Crystal Fyffe near the end of her story, which is why understanding her death means going back before Killer B ran anything. To understand the crew Leadbetter eventually controlled, you have to start with the Columbus neighborhood that already carried the Short North name decades earlier. Around 1980, longtime civic leader Jack Decker remembered the High Street corridor as distressed, crime-ridden, with drivers locking their doors before pushing through quickly. Police dispatchers had started calling the area the Short North due to its position north of downtown, just below the university district surrounding Ohio State. That rough environment did not automatically create the gang, but it gave the next generation a tight set of blocks where street crews could organize. By 1989, Robert June Dotson and Marshawn Mays were moving through those blocks after a friend was shot during a drug trafficking incident. Their response was to form a group that could protect its people while carving out control over cocaine sales around the neighborhood. The Short North Posse began building around places people actually knew, including the Golden 8 Ball Pool Hall at 222 East 11th Avenue. Another spot called the Juke Joint operated on East 9th, where members could pick up cocaine or guns before heading back outside. With those locations functioning as street infrastructure, the posse gained enough presence that its name became tied closely to gang activity around the Short North. That visibility eventually brought serious heat, so Columbus police began targeting gang activity there with undercover detectives plus covert drug stings during 1993. By May 1994, federal authorities had joined the investigation, meaning the crew now had local officers and federal agents working the same problem. Then March 1995 brought a sweeping prosecution with more than 200 charges against over 40 alleged members for drugs, weapons, money laundering, plus related offenses. Many defendants received maximum sentences, which ripped major pieces out of the original organization, while federal authorities tried shutting the operation down for good. From the outside, the Short North Posse looked finished, yet removing one generation did not remove the name or the neighborhood network behind it. That gap created room for another wave, and by the early 2000s, Columbus police were already using the label New Short North Posse. A 2003 snapshot of the city showed police tracking multiple blood sets, multiple Crip sets, plus several other groups operating across Columbus. Within that landscape, the Short North name had survived its first federal takedown, while younger members inherited a reputation built before many reached adulthood. Sometime after 2005, two labels began appearing inside this later version. First the Cutthroat Committee, followed afterward by the Homicide Squad. Those smaller groups would eventually become central to federal allegations involving robberies and killings. But one man was increasingly positioned near the center of everything. Robert Killer B Leadbetter belonged to that second generation, although reliable public records give almost no detailed account of his childhood or early years. What the record does establish is that he came after the 1995 crackdown, when the founding crew had already absorbed a massive federal hit. By the mid-2000s, investigators described Leadbetter as a major drug supplier who recruited associates, directed criminal activity, then shared proceeds from jobs carried out around him. He had Short North tattooed across his chest, while his position increasingly depended on sending other people toward the most dangerous parts of street business. That arrangement gave him something valuable on the street, since the farther he stood from a trigger, the harder every violent job became to trace directly. As Leadbetter's influence grew, drugs could move through people he supplied, while robberies or other jobs could be handled by crews taking instructions from him. Participants could split whatever money, drugs, or property came back, with Leadbetter receiving his share without needing to stand inside every room where trouble started. That structure also created layers between the person selecting a target and whoever finally confronted that target, which gave the whole setup more room to breathe. The original Short North Posse had already survived one enormous federal sweep, yet this newer version was becoming more organized around delegated work and shared profit. Before investigators finally pulled those layers apart, several people would be robbed, several would die, while Ledbetter often remained somewhere near the edge of the scene. By the mid-2000s, Robert Killer B. Ledbetter had moved beyond simply supplying drugs around Columbus and started directing people toward profitable, violent work. Federal prosecutors later described him as a major supplier who recruited associates for robberies, murders, and jobs aimed at rival dealers or competing gang members. Inside the rebuilt Short North Posse, the Cutthroat Committee and Homicide Squad gave that setup structure, with crews used for targets considered worth hitting. Those targets included so-called deep pockets, people believed to be carrying serious cash, drugs, or guns, which turned street information into possible robbery money. Christopher O-Dog Harris, Rashad Buckwheat, Liston, and Deontay D. Frog. Usury became names tied closely to that violent inner circle, while Ledbetter often stayed farther back. That distance mattered during a period when the crew was already surrounded by serious gunplay, including a 2006 clash with rival D-Block members in Columbus. More than 300 rounds were fired during that gun battle, with several people shot, showing how quickly disputes around this network could explode into sustained violence. The shooting itself was only one event among many later introduced as evidence of criminal activity tied to the enterprise, yet it showed the environment Ledbetter operated inside. While those broader battles kept pressure high across the streets, a separate killing in Ledbetter's own family pushed his attention toward one specific 23-year-old man. Sometime in 2006, Ledbetter's brother was killed, and suspicion within his circle soon settled on Alan Johnson as the person responsible. Samantha Murphy later told jurors that Ledbetter made his intentions clear after his brother's death, saying he wanted the man responsible taken care of. According to her account, the move toward Johnson soon became organized, with armed men gathering at Murphy's house after somebody called with Johnson's location. Some of the men pulled on black hoodies before leaving, turning what began as grief inside Ledbetter's family into a crew operation aimed at one target. Anthony Jones later added another angle, explaining that Ledbetter and Marcus Peters picked him up in a van before Jones directed them toward Johnson's apartment. Once they reached the location, Jones said Ledbetter and Peters stepped from the vehicle carrying guns, then met Christopher Harris outside before moving toward the apartment. Jones remained with the van, so his view stopped at the doorway, yet the gunshots he heard moments later filled in what happened inside. According to his testimony, Ledbetter and Peters eventually came back out, while other witnesses later carried separate pieces of the killing through the posse's social circle. Kenneth Slaughter testified that Peters later told him Peters and Harris shot Johnson, while Ledbetter accompanied them during the operation. Earl Williams heard another version from Peters, who said the group had caught Johnson inside a place before Peters, and Harris shot him dead. Those accounts mattered later since nobody needed one witness holding the complete story when several people could describe different pieces of the same job. Troy Patterson brought the money angle into that picture, testifying that Harris described the murder and said Ledbetter paid Harris and Peters $10,000 afterward. Alan Wright also testified that he heard Harris acknowledge killing Johnson, which meant details from the apartment were already spreading among people around the Short North Posse. Crystal Fyffe, Ledbetter's girlfriend, entered this story from another direction, telling her attorney and mother that Ledbetter had personally killed his brother's suspected killer. Murphy also testified that Ledbetter later told her he had taken care of Johnson, while claiming Johnson's own girlfriend had been paid for providing his location. By then, the murder no longer existed as one secret shared by three men, since Jones, Slaughter, Williams, Patterson, Wright, Murphy, and Crystal each carried something investigators could later use. A federal jury eventually convicted Ledbetter of murder in aid of racketeering for Johnson's death, even without evidence proving he personally fired the fatal shots. That outcome matched the structure prosecutors said he had been building, where targets could be selected, crews assembled, money divided, then responsibility scattered across several people afterward. Johnson's killing also brought Christopher Harris deeper into the central narrative, while Earl Williams, Troy Patterson, Alan Wright, and Crystal Fyffe quietly became future problems for Ledbetter. Each one had heard, seen, handled, or repeated information that could connect a violent job back toward the man operating near the center. What started with revenge over Ledbetter's brother would soon expand into something colder, as robbery money, jealousy, drugs, and valuable targets began producing new bodies. By late 2007, the Short North Posse was no longer dealing only with street rivalries, since personal grudges could also be turned into organized robberies. strip club proprietor Michael Boyd later told jurors that Ledbetter had shown open hostility toward Rodriguez Williams, who was seeing Ledbetter's former girlfriend, Latonia Boyce. Boyd said Ledbetter also described how his cutthroat committee hurt people, which worried him enough to warn Williams and Boyce to stay away. That warning would matter on November 3, 2007, when the conflict moved from talk around a club to a home invasion near Pickerington. Instead of walking into the house himself, Ledbetter allegedly built the job around younger men who could handle the dangerous part while he stayed close enough to supervise. Earl Williams later gave investigators the inside version, explaining that Ledbetter recruited him to supervise Christopher O-Dog Harris, Rashad Buckwheat Liston, plus R.J. Wilson during the robbery. As the crew approached the house, Ledbetter was speaking with Latonia Boyce by phone, using information from inside the home to time their move. Boyce told him Rodriguez and the children were returning from a movie, so the men waited until the family reached the house before rushing the entrance. Harris, Liston, and Wilson struggled with Rodriguez just inside, while Earl ran upstairs and pointed a gun at Boyce to rob her. Ledbetter, according to Earl, remained around the doorway overseeing the operation, which placed him near the action without putting him inside the hardest part of the fight. That setup broke down fast, since Earl was still upstairs with Boyce when gunfire started below him, and Rodriguez Williams was shot to death. Boyce later confirmed speaking with Ledbetter that night, while phone records supported the contact prosecutors said was feeding the crew real-time information. Her brother-in-law also described seeing 3 masked men in black clothing storm into the house with Williams before the shooting erupted inside. Crystal Fyffe added another link, telling her attorney and law enforcement that Ledbetter had asked her for directions to Williams's home earlier that day. She later told her mother that she disposed of black clothing and masks after the killing, while cell site records placed Ledbetter's phone near Pickerington during the murder. The Williams case also created a problem Ledbetter could not see clearly at the time, since Earl Williams had personally watched the job unfold from inside. Earl knew who had been recruited, who waited for the family, who went through the doorway, plus who remained positioned close enough to oversee everything. That knowledge became dangerous once Earl landed in jail on unrelated charges and Ledbetter started worrying that he might be talking to police. The fear would eventually prove justified, although another robbery would first show investigators how easily the same operating method could leave somebody dead. This time, the target was Marshall Brumfield, with Ledbetter allegedly choosing him after watching something valuable happen right in front of him. Troy Patterson later testified that Ledbetter watched Brumfield buy a large quantity of drugs from one of Ledbetter's own dealers, then followed him home afterward. Once Ledbetter knew where Brumfield lived, he allegedly sent Patterson, Liston, Defrog, Usury, Harris, plus a man identified as Franklin to rob him. Ledbetter did not ride directly into the confrontation, choosing instead to park nearby while the others moved toward Brumfield's apartment. Patterson later described him as watching from behind the scenes, which matched the distance prosecutors said Ledbetter preferred when dangerous street work started moving. The crew had the target, the location, plus enough manpower to take whatever Brumfield carried, but the robbery changed immediately when Brumfield decided to fight. Patterson and Harris were knocking near Brumfield's door when Brumfield returned home, putting the target directly in front of the men waiting for him. The crew ordered him to strip, but Brumfield resisted and started swinging, turning the planned robbery into a close-range fight outside his apartment. Liston responded by shooting Brumfield 3 times in the stomach, after which Usury and Franklin fired another 3 or 4 rounds into him. 2 neighbors later corroborated pieces of the confrontation and its aftermath, while Patterson said Harris explained that Ledbetter ordered the operation after watching Brumfield's drug purchase. What was supposed to be a robbery of somebody carrying valuable product had now become another homicide tied back through several witnesses and participants. By then, the overlap between these killings was getting hard to ignore, since Harris and Liston had already surfaced in more than one violent job. Earl Williams had first-hand knowledge of the Rodriguez Williams invasion, while Patterson could explain how the Brumfield target was selected, organized, then watched from nearby. Ledbetter's method gave him distance from the trigger, yet every extra person involved also created another mouth that could later describe what happened. That weakness became more important once investigators started separating personal violence from actual Short North Posse business, forcing prosecutors to prove which shootings truly served the enterprise. The next deaths would push that question harder, since a gang member killing somebody did not automatically mean Killer B or the posse had ordered it. By this point, the Short North Posse already had members tied to robberies and murders, but not every violent move followed the same chain of command. One case centered on Deontay D. Frog, usury, who was asked by dealer Tabib Broomfield to handle a marijuana sale after Broomfield ran out. The buyer was Dante Hill, who arrived with his girlfriend Casey Martin, then went inside while she waited behind the wheel outside the house. What started as a simple drug pickup changed within moments when Hill suddenly came running back toward the car with a man in a black hoodie behind him. Before Martin could make sense of what was happening, Hill was shot, while the hooded gunman ran away without giving her a clear look at his face. Tabib Broomfield was returning toward the area when he noticed Usury's vehicle pulling away while Hill's car remained sitting near the house. When Broomfield reached the scene, he found Hill bleeding while Casey Martin struggled to get him into the car after the sudden shooting. Broomfield then called Usury, who told him everything had gone bad while claiming Hill had tried doing something to him during the meeting. That explanation did not sit right with Broomfield, who later described Hill as much smaller physically than Usury, making the story harder for him to accept. Other witnesses eventually said Usury admitted trying to rob Hill before shooting him after Hill allegedly reached for a gun, then asked associates for help disposing of the weapon. That killing immediately complicated the wider picture, since Usury already appeared in Marshall Brumfield's murder alongside Liston, Harris, Patterson, and Franklin. Here, however, nobody had yet shown Leadbetter watching nearby, selecting Hill as a target, arranging a crew, or expecting any money from the robbery. The difference mattered, even if the result looked familiar on the street, since another man had been shot during a setup involving drugs and robbery. For investigators, the bigger question was becoming harder to avoid as these bodies piled up around the same names and overlapping circles. Were all these shootings Short North Posse business, or were some members making violent moves on their own once they left Killer B's orbit? That question became even messier when outside associates started joining jobs with established homicide squad members, which widened the circle beyond the core names already following Leadbetter. In August 2007, another robbery targeted Greg Cunningham, who operated an illegal after-hours entertainment business where people believed large amounts of cash might be stored. The crew assembled for that home invasion included Christopher O-Dog Harris, R.J. Wilson, Rastaman Wilson, David Hurst, plus Clifford, Tink Robinson. Harris and R.J. Wilson were already connected to the homicide squad, while Robinson operated closer to an outside associate brought into specific work for a share. David Hurst took the getaway role, expecting several $1,000s if the group found the money everyone believed Cunningham kept inside. Once the group reached Cunningham's property, Harris broke through the door, sending the robbery crew rushing inside before anybody there could properly react. Donathan Moon, who was inside as a guest, took off toward a bedroom and slammed the door behind him while trying to get away. Robinson came through behind Harris carrying an AK-47, then fired 3 rounds through the closed bedroom door where Moon had disappeared seconds earlier. R.J. Wilson followed into the room with a handgun, then shot Moon again after Robinson's rounds had already ripped through the doorway. After all that gunfire, the crew searched the house for the cash they came to steal, yet the money they expected was nowhere inside. They left empty-handed, turning what was supposed to be a profitable home invasion into a killing that produced no payday whatsoever. Hurst's role gave prosecutors a clean financial link, since he said the getaway job came with an expected cut from whatever money the crew recovered. Robinson later tried arguing that investigators had identified the wrong man called Tink, but 2 witnesses identified him personally while matching details about his family. That defense failed, leaving Robinson tied directly to Moon's killing, even though he was not treated like a regular Short North Posse member. His position showed how flexible these crews could become, with formal members working beside outsiders whenever extra hands were useful for a particular robbery. The same flexibility also created more witnesses, more overlapping relationships, and more people who could eventually explain how separate jobs connected back toward the larger enterprise. By now, familiar names were showing up across different crime scenes, which made the Short North Posse look less like isolated shooters moving independently around Columbus. Christopher Harris had surfaced around Alan Johnson, Rodriguez Williams, and Donathan Moon, placing him close to multiple killings across different motives and locations. Rashad Liston appeared during the Williams home invasion before becoming one of Marshall Brumfield's shooters, while Usury moved from Brumfield into the Dante Hill case. Troy Patterson knew how Brumfield was selected. Anthony Jones knew the route toward Johnson. Kenneth Slaughter heard Peters talk, while Alan Wright heard Harris acknowledge killing Johnson. Samantha Murphy, Michael Boyd, Latonia Boyce, Tabib Broomfield, Earl Williams, Casey Martin, plus David Hurst each held different pieces from separate corners of the story. That growing witness pool exposed the weakness inside Ledbetter's preferred system, since every delegated job created distance from him while putting more people inside the secret. Earl Williams had already been inside the Rodriguez home invasion, while Patterson had watched the Brumfield robbery develop from Ledbetter's instructions toward gunfire. Hurst knew the Moon crew expected to split, while several other associates had heard confessions, handled information, or watched participants moving before and after killings. The setup still gave Killer B room to stay away from many triggers, but that protection depended heavily on everybody around him keeping quiet afterward. Once people inside that circle started talking to investigators, the same layers built to protect Ledbetter could begin pointing straight back toward him. By the time Earl Williams landed in jail on unrelated charges, he already knew exactly how one of Ledbetter's organized home invasions had worked. Earl had been upstairs robbing Latonia Boyce at gunpoint, while Rodriguez Williams was being attacked downstairs during the November 2007 Pickerington job. He had watched Ledbetter recruit the crew, use Boyce's phone call for timing, then remain near the doorway while younger members handled the dangerous work. That made Earl different from people who only heard street talk afterward, since he had actually participated inside the operation prosecutors later tied to Ledbetter. Once Earl was locked up, Ledbetter started worrying that somebody with that much first-hand knowledge might start cutting deals with investigators. That concern was right on the money, since Earl eventually cooperated and described the Williams robbery from inside the crew that carried it out. His account did not stand alone either, because Latonia Boyce confirmed her phone conversation, while cell records helped support important pieces of his story. Rodriguez Williams' brother-in-law had also seen masked men rush the house, giving investigators another perspective from outside the crew itself. Together, those details gave prosecutors something stronger than neighborhood rumors, since Earl's version could be checked against witnesses who had never shared his exact position. More importantly, his cooperation showed investigators that the people Ledbetter used as protection could eventually become the people explaining his system to a jury. Still, Earl was nowhere close to being the only person carrying information, which made Ledbetter's problem much bigger than one dude deciding to talk. Samantha Murphy knew what Ledbetter said after his brother's killing, while Anthony Jones knew how the crew traveled toward Alan Johnson's apartment. Kenneth Slaughter and Alan Wright had heard admissions from men involved, while Troy Patterson knew how Marshall Brumfield had been selected for robbery. Michael Boyd knew about Ledbetter's hostility toward Rodriguez Williams, while Tabib Broomfield held another piece involving Deontay Ushery and Dante Hill. David Hurst could explain the expected payout from the Donathan Moon home invasion, leaving investigators with separate witnesses whose stories touched different corners of the same network. That growing witness pool changed the pressure around the Short North Posse, since investigators could start matching memories against phone records, locations, admissions, and crime scenes. One person might know who selected a target, while somebody else knew who carried the gun, who drove, or who expected money afterward. Those fragments mattered more once prosecutors began connecting jobs that looked separate on the surface, but repeatedly brought back familiar names from Ledbetter's circle. Yet among everyone who knew something, Crystal Fyffe carried information that touched both Ledbetter's criminal life and the private violence surrounding their relationship. Her position became especially dangerous once Ledbetter was jailed, leaving her outside with information he could no longer control, face to face. Crystal was Ledbetter's girlfriend, but the danger around her started long before investigators began treating her as somebody who knew too much about the Short North Posse. Court testimony described a relationship marked by violence, including one incident where Ledbetter tied Crystal up after she threatened to leave him, then shot her in the hand. Later text messages showed another ugly stretch between them, with prosecutors reading some communications as death threats after Crystal confronted Ledbetter about cheating. By the time Ledbetter was jailed on other charges, she knew details touching robberies, killings, disguises, phone calls, and people around his crew. That made her important in the Rodriguez Williams investigation, where her information overlapped with what other witnesses told police. Crystal told her attorney and law enforcement that Ledbetter contacted her for directions to Rodriguez Williams' house on the day that home invasion ended with Williams shot dead. She also told her mother that she later disposed of black clothing and masks, items Earl Williams identified as gear worn by the robbery crew. Those details placed Crystal close enough to the aftermath that investigators could compare her account with phone records, Earl's testimony, and evidence from Pickerington. Once Ledbetter began believing she was cooperating, Prosecutors said the pressure changed from private arguments into something more deliberate, with threats reaching her while he remained locked up. Crystal showed her attorney an actual letter from Ledbetter, warning her about continuing to cooperate. The strangest part involved a man Crystal knew only by the street name Santa, whom she described to her mother as a contract killer working for Ledbetter. One of Ledbetter's letters later mentioned that Santa Claus would be coming to town, language prosecutors treated as a threat beside what Crystal had already told her family. Court records never identify Santa by a confirmed legal name, so nobody can place a real person behind that nickname or tie him to Crystal's shooting. Prosecutors also presented communications suggesting Ledbetter had circulated photographs of Crystal among Short North Posse associates, which they argued could help people locate her while he remained behind bars. That pushed the threat beyond letters, since it suggested somebody outside could be given enough information to find the woman Ledbetter believed was talking. By then, Crystal had created a trail that could survive if something happened to her, with pieces resting in separate hands instead of one conversation. Her mother knew about Santa. Her attorney had seen the threatening letter, and investigators had statements connecting Ledbetter to the Williams house, clothing and masks. None of those people could say who would eventually pull a trigger, but they could describe what Crystal feared before that moment arrived. That made her position dangerous, since Ledbetter was locked away while information about his past was moving through people he could not control. Then the story catches back up with the scene from the beginning, when Crystal returned home one evening carrying a pizza, and somebody was waiting. She was shot in the head outside her own residence, while whoever pulled the trigger left without taking her phone, keys, or other obvious property. No eyewitness identified the shooter, which meant investigators could not simply follow somebody seen running from the scene back toward Ledbetter or his crew. Ledbetter was already incarcerated when Crystal died, yet prosecutors argued that her killing followed the same principle behind earlier jobs attributed to him. He did not need to physically stand over the victim if somebody else could carry out an order while he remained somewhere removed from the gunfire. A federal jury eventually convicted Ledbetter of murder in aid of racketeering, conspiracy to murder a witness, plus a firearm offense connected to Crystal's death. Her murder removed one person who could have testified about his criminal activity, but it could not erase statements she had already made before being killed. Earl Williams was talking. Patterson had information. Murphy remembered Ledbetter's words, while Jones, Slaughter, Wright, Boyd, Boyce, Broomfield, and Hurst held their own pieces. That was where Ledbetter's old strategy started working against him, since delegation had kept him away from many triggers while spreading knowledge among dozens of people. By the time federal investigators pulled those pieces together, they were preparing a case big enough to drag the Short North Posse into one courtroom. By 2013, federal and local investigators were no longer chasing one crew, since several layers of the Short North Posse were under pressure. That year, another sweep charged 22 people with drug trafficking and gun offenses tied to the gang's broader network around Columbus. Some defendants were relatives of earlier members, showing how the same name had stretched from the 1990s into another generation. While that investigation moved forward, authorities were also building a separate case around the men accused of supplying the posse's muscle. By the following summer, those parallel tracks started closing around Robert Killer B. Ledbetter, and the crew prosecutors said handled robberies, threats, and killings. In July 2014, federal prosecutors publicly announced Operation Get Shorty, targeting 17 suspects described as muscle for the Short North Posse. The wider prosecution eventually reached 20 defendants, with alleged crimes stretching through Columbus, Canal Winchester, Chillicothe, Pataskala, Pickerington, and Zanesville. Prosecutors tied the broader investigation to 13 unsolved homicides, 33 attempted homicides, 56 violent felonies, plus 73 weapons offenses committed between 2005 and 2012. The roster pulled together familiar cooperators and new defendants, including Andre Paco Brown, Jonathan Doughboy Holt, Christopher Wharton, Lance Reynolds, Joseph Hill, Troy Patterson, and Ishmael Bowers. Alan Wright, Tyson Gordon, Freddie Johnson, Robert Wilson III, and Lance Green were also swept into a case now reaching far beyond one neighborhood. Some names carried direct links to killings already running through the story, while others showed how many separate crews had moved around the enterprise. Lance Reynolds was identified in court records as someone who organized robberies of rival drug dealers while recruiting outside associates, including Holt, for particular jobs. Robert Wilson III eventually pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and accepted responsibility for Donathan Moon, Rodriguez Williams, and Tyrell Davis. Wilson had already pleaded guilty to another murder in state court, giving prosecutors 4 killings attached to one defendant across separate proceedings. Marcus Peters, accused of helping kill Alan Johnson alongside Ledbetter, died before his federal case could be resolved, leaving that branch without a trial. Of the 20 defendants, 13 chose guilty pleas while 6 were eventually convicted at trial, and 1 died before reaching a final resolution. That split gave prosecutors admitted conduct from some defendants, cooperating testimony from others, plus several men still willing to fight the case before jurors. By spring 2016, the central trial brought Ledbetter together with Christopher O. Dog Harris, Rashad Buckwheat Liston, Deontay D. Frog Ussery, and Clifford Tink Robinson. Their cases now placed years of murders, robberies, phone calls, witness statements, gang ties, and shared crews inside one federal courtroom. The government no longer needed each crime standing alone, since prosecutors were trying to show how separate jobs fit inside one racketeering enterprise. The trial ran roughly 2 months before United States District Judge Algernon L. Marbley, with prosecutors calling more than 100 witnesses. Earl Williams returned as the insider from the Rodriguez Williams home invasion, describing how the crew waited, entered the house, and killed Rodriguez downstairs. Troy Patterson brought jurors back to Marshall Brumfield, explaining how Ledbetter allegedly spotted the drug purchase before sending men toward Brumfield's apartment. Anthony Jones connected the Alan Johnson killing to Ledbetter, Marcus Peters, and Christopher Harris, while other witnesses supplied admissions heard afterward. Crystal Fyffe could not enter that courtroom herself, yet her earlier statements, letters, threats, and information connected to Williams still remained part of the case. Prosecutors strengthened those accounts with cell site data, phone records, physical evidence, photographs, tattoos, plus testimony explaining how the Short North Posse operated. LAPD Detective Wayne Fyffe handled the broader gang context after 35 years in policing, including 12 years working inside a gang surveillance unit. Fyffe explained Crips' history, neighborhood sets, shared symbols, and national patterns, while acknowledging he had no specific personal knowledge of Columbus gangs. Columbus Police Lieutenant Smith Weir filled that local gap through years of direct observations around the Short North neighborhood and people associated with the posse. Together, their testimony helped prosecutors argue these defendants belonged to an enterprise instead of being unrelated dudes committing separate crimes around Columbus. Defense attorneys went hard at the government's witness network, especially cooperators like Earl Williams and Patterson, who carried their own criminal exposure or plea agreements. Their argument was straightforward, since people facing serious prison time had strong reasons to give prosecutors information that might improve their own position. They also pushed to separate defendants into different trials, arguing that one man could get stained by another co-defendant's more violent history. Judge Marbley rejected that effort, while prosecutors maintained that much of the same racketeering evidence would remain admissible even during separate proceedings. That courtroom fight mattered, since the case depended heavily on overlapping witnesses whose credibility became almost as important as the killings they described. The tension produced 2 unusual moments, although neither was ultimately allowed to become evidence against Ledbetter or his defense attorney. Earl Williams testified that Ledbetter's lawyer visited him in prison, allegedly encouraging him to replace his attorney while questioning what he had already disclosed. The judge excluded that portion of Earl's testimony and specifically instructed jurors not to infer wrongdoing by defense counsel from the allegation. Later, Anthony Jones blurted out an accusation suggesting Ledbetter's attorney had provided information that somehow contributed to Crystal Fyffe's murder. The judge struck that remark, told jurors to disregard it completely, then made clear there was no evidentiary basis supporting the accusation. After 8 weeks of testimony, the case finally reached a verdict on June 9, 2016, with all 5 central defendants convicted. Ledbetter, Harris, Liston, Ussery, and Robinson were found guilty on every count submitted to that jury after years of federal investigation. Those convictions accounted for 10 of the 14 previously unsolved homicides connected to the wider indictment, giving prosecutors their biggest result against the posse. Jonathan Holt went to trial separately afterward and was also convicted on every count he faced, extending the federal sweep beyond Ledbetter's courtroom. What looked like scattered street killings had now been assembled into one legal record, but those convictions were only the first version of the ending. The next stage would decide who spent life in federal prison, which convictions survived review, plus whether every killing truly belonged inside the racketeering case. That question mattered most for men like Ussery, whose Dante Hill killing had always looked different from jobs involving shared proceeds or direct orders. It also mattered for Harrison Robinson, whose Donathan Moon convictions would later collide with a major Supreme Court ruling involving firearm statutes. Ledbetter faced an even harder road, since prosecutors had tied him to murders where he rarely needed to stand beside whoever pulled the trigger. The courtroom had accepted that theory, but the appeals process would determine how much of the government's case could actually survive intact. On March 17, 2017, Robert Killer B. Ledbetter returned to federal court facing punishment for the operation prosecutors had spent years pulling apart. The judge sentenced him to life for Alan Johnson's racketeering murder, followed by another consecutive life term connected to murder through use of a firearm. Additional consecutive punishment followed from convictions tied to Rodriguez Williams, Marshall Brumfield, plus Crystal Fyffe, leaving Ledbetter with several life sentences stacked together. That structure mattered since losing one conviction later would not realistically put him anywhere close to release, while the other murder judgments remained standing behind it. The man who had often kept himself away from the trigger was now legally responsible for killings carried out through crews, instructions, money, plus people willing to do the dangerous work. Ledbetter was only the biggest sentence inside a prosecution that kept working through defendants long after the 2016 trial finished. Lance Green became the last of the original 20 defendants sentenced, receiving 17 years after pleading guilty to racketeering conspiracy plus 2 murders in aid of racketeering. Alan Wright pleaded guilty to conspiracy plus 2 racketeering murders, while Joseph Hill also admitted conspiracy alongside 2 separate murder counts. Christopher Wharton pleaded guilty to a murder charge with cocaine and marijuana distribution offenses, while Troy Patterson and Ishmael Bowers each admitted 1 murder in aid of racketeering. Tyson Gordon and Freddie Johnson took racketeering conspiracy pleas, leaving prosecutors with convictions or guilty pleas spread across nearly the entire roster swept into Operation Get Shorty. Still, a federal verdict is not always the final word, so Ledbetter, Harris, Liston, Ussery, and Robinson pushed their cases into the Sixth Circuit. Their appeals were argued on March 13, 2019, before the court issued its decision on July 3rd after considering more than 15 claims across 5 defendants. Most arguments failed, but Deontay D-Frog Ussery finally got an answer to the question hanging over Dante Hill's killing from years earlier. The court left Ussery's underlying murder conviction untouched while throwing out the racketeering enhancement, finding insufficient evidence that Hill's death had been committed for short North Posse business. In other words, Ussery remained convicted of killing Hill, but federal judges refused to treat that particular robbery as a sanctioned gang job without stronger proof. Christopher O-Dog Harris and Clifford Tink Robinson also won 1 narrow point connected to the Donathan Moon home invasion, although it did not erase their murder liability. A Supreme Court decision in United States v. Davis had invalidated the statutory clause supporting 1 firearm conviction, forcing those specific counts to be vacated. The underlying case surrounding Moon still remained, including the August 2007 invasion where Robinson fired through a bedroom door before R.J. Wilson entered and shot Moon again. Rashad Buckwheat Liston received no comparable break, while his convictions survived the appellate challenge without the same kind of reduction. Ledbetter did even worse on appeal, since every principal conviction tied to his racketeering operation, murders, plus life sentences, remained firmly in place. That left the men moving through very different futures from the neighborhood whose name they had carried through years of robberies, gunfire, and federal investigations. Ledbetter remained in federal prison serving consecutive life terms, while Harris and Robinson stayed incarcerated under surviving murder convictions despite their narrow appellate victories. Ussery kept his underlying Dante Hill murder conviction even after the court separated that shooting from the Posse enterprise, while Liston's judgments remained affirmed. Meanwhile, Columbus's short north had transformed into a gallery, restaurant, and entertainment district where visitors could walk High Street without seeing the neighborhood described in the old gang cases. The same name once attached to cocaine crews, the Golden 8 Ball, the Juke Joint, plus generations of street cases now sat across an area better known publicly for art, food, nightlife, and redevelopment. That transformation also makes the Posse's timeline stranger, since Robert June Dotson and Martian Mays had started the original group back in 1989 before federal prosecutors hit it hard during 1995. Years later came the new Short North Posse, followed by the Cutthroat Committee, Homicide Squad, Ledbetter's leadership, plus another generation caught in parallel investigations during the 2010s. Some defendants from later sweeps were relatives of earlier members, showing how the name survived longer than many individual people who carried it through Columbus. Public records never established a clean date when the Short North Posse officially stopped existing, so the documented story ends with prosecutions rather than any confirmed declaration of extinction. What can be traced clearly is Ledbetter's method, where other men entered houses, confronted targets, fired shots, then carried pieces of the story back into a circle that eventually talked. The distance that once helped Killer B stay near the edge of those crime scenes never stopped the murders from following him into federal court.